PRIČA iz Niša My mother closed the door when he came into my room. I was only 8 years old. Now, when I look back, I can clearly see the whole picture. Every fragment hurts, and every little thing that led to this moment of silent strength that I feel. But then, at the age of 8, in our apartment in Zagreb, the world was a confusing mix of shadows and discomfort. I can still feel the goosebumps on my skin as I remember that cold feeling in the air, the ominous click of the door, and the silence that always followed. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear, heavy and oppressive, which would creep into every corner of my small room. It was Luka, my mother's new partner, who was coming in, and my mother, Ivanka, as if by some invisible agreement, would close the door behind him. She wouldn't just pull it gently, but slam it shut, making sure that heavy final click was heard. That sound, for years, was the soundtrack to my trauma. I remember my mother's face in those moments. It was not the face of cruelty, but the face of an exhausted woman, pale and absent, her gaze lost somewhere behind me, as if she had already detached herself from the scene that was about to unfold. She never said, "Don't be afraid," to me. She never looked me in the eyes and comforted me. Just that empty gaze and the closed door. I would sit on the edge of the bed, huddled against the pillow, following the shadows playing on the walls as Luka moved around the room. His voice, quiet and threatening, was like a whisper from a nightmare. "Marija," he would say, and I would shrink away. He didn't dare touch me. He made that clear. But his words, his looks, were just as poisonous. In those moments, I felt like a bird caught in a cage, helpless and scared. My mind, childish and innocent, tried to understand why this was happening. Why did my mother allow it? Didn't she love me? Was Luka more important than me? Questions swirled around in my head, unanswered, leaving behind only a deep, burning wound. The feeling of betrayal, so raw and so deep, began to echo in my heart. Every time that door closed, a part of my innocence died. I felt invisible, like no one could hear me, like no one could see me. Luka would force me to shut up, not to cry, not to talk to anyone. "No one will believe you, Marija," he would say, his smile frozen on his face. "Your mother won't listen to you. She's too caught up in love." Those words would echo inside me, like blows, confirming my deepest fear. I was alone. There were subtle but equally damaging moments. For example, Luka would deliberately drop things on me and then accuse me of being clumsy or lazy, or he would force me to eat food I hated while Ivanka sat quietly, staring into the stove. "It's for your own good, Marija," she would say sometimes, avoiding my gaze. Her silence was like a knife in my back, worse than Luka's threats. It wasn't just physical or emotional pain, but a feeling of absolute injustice, the realization that I was at the mercy of someone who didn't want me, and that the one who was supposed to protect me wasn't doing so. I watched my mother, the woman who was supposed to be my shield, how she was being dragged down, how she was becoming a shadow of Luka's will. I never understood why she did it. Was she afraid of him? Was she blinded by love? Or was she simply too weak to resist? Regardless of the reason, the consequences were devastating for my child's soul. I began to withdraw into myself, building walls around my heart. I lost trust, not only in Lukan, but also in Ivanka. My dreams became a battlefield. Waking up was a relief, but the memories would return, like ghosts, haunting me throughout the day. Even at the playground with other children, I felt different, as if I were carrying an invisible burden. Every smile, every laugh of the others seemed false to me, as if they didn't understand the depth of the darkness I carried inside me. I asked myself if I would ever be free from that feeling, if I would ever be able to breathe without fear. As the years passed, the walls I had built around myself grew higher and thicker. I was no longer just a frightened child, but a teenager with scars on my soul, and my heart was constantly in turmoil, ready to flee. Luka eventually stopped coming to my room, but his presence in our home in Zagreb was just as suffocating. It was like a poisonous fog that spread through every room, every glance, every silent remark reminded me of my helplessness. My mother, Ivanka, was still there, but she had become a shadow of herself, invisible, obedient, lost in Luka's shadow. Their relationship was painful, permeated by a strange dynamic of power in which Luka was the absolute master, and she was his faithful, but exhausted servant. I tried to talk to her many times. As a teenager, seeking answers I never got as a child. "Mom, why do you let him do this?" I would ask, with tears in my eyes. "Why can't you see what he's doing to us?" Her answer was always the same, empty and recited like a memorized lesson. "Luka is a good man, Marita, you just don't understand him." Or she would look at me with that familiar distant gaze and say, "He doesn't behave like that toward his mother. I raised you to be decent." Those words hurt more than anything else because they denied my reality, my pain, my truth. I felt like my mother not only didn't believe me, but was actively participating in Luka's deception, in his efforts to break me. I tried to find refuge in school. In books became my escape. My friends, in them I found worlds where I was the heroine, and justice always prevailed. I studied, I worked my way through the material, knowing that education was my only way out. Friendships were difficult for me. I was afraid to let people get close, afraid they would discover my weaknesses, my shame. Nina, my best friend, was the only one who sensed that something was wrong, even though I never spoke about the depth of my suffering. Her presence comforted me. Her laughter reminded me that there was still hope, that somewhere there was a normal world, but home was always a magnet that pulled me back into the darkness. Life in Luka's shadow was a constant struggle for survival. He controlled everything, from finances to our social life. He gradually isolated us from our family and friends, claiming that they were a negative influence or jealous of our happiness. I remember once when my grandmother, Ivanka's mother, wanted to come visit us. Luka made up some urgent business and prevented her from coming. Later my mother was very sad, but she didn't dare say anything. That's when I realized that Luka was not only manipulating us, but also actively destroying our ties with the outside world. Once he humiliated me in public at the supermarket. We were shopping, and I accidentally dropped a bottle of sour cream. It shattered with a loud crash. Luka started yelling at me, pushing me in front of everyone, calling me clumsy and wasteful. People were looking at us, and I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. My mother stood next to him, pale as a sheet, not uttering a word. At that moment something broke inside me. It was no longer just sadness or fear, it was a fever, a rage that began to boil beneath the surface. I looked at Luke's face, contorted with anger, and realized that he wasn't just a bully, he was a cuckoo. His power came from our weakness, from my mother's obedience, and my helplessness. That day, standing in line at the cash register, gathering the courage to look people in the eye, I began to realize that I had to find a way to free myself. I didn't want to be a victim anymore. I didn't want to let Luka's shadow take my life away from me anymore. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew I had to. I started thinking about the future, about leaving Zagreb, about how I would build my life, far away from Luka's control. It was a difficult path, but realizing that I had a choice, even if it seemed impossible, was the first spark of hope in my long darkness. My teenage years were filled with this latent anxiety and a constant search for a way out. Luka was becoming increasingly violent, and his control was becoming tighter, enveloping our family like a poisonous fog. Finances became an obsession for him, and every month I would hear him arguing with my mother about money, always accusing her of being reckless, even though he was the one who made all the decisions. We became increasingly isolated. Family visits became less frequent. Friends stopped calling. Luka created an image of an idyllic family to the outside world, while inside the four walls of our apartment in Zagreb, fear reigned. I remember when my grandmother, Aven Kuno's mother, tried to get in touch with us several times, but Luka always ignored her calls or made up excuses why we couldn't come. My mother, visibly sad, didn't argue with him, which frustrated me immensely. Her passivity became as painful as Luca's cruelty. The biggest blow came when my grandmother died. Luca didn't allow my mother to attend the funeral, claiming that she was sick. I felt terrible sadness, but also helplessness. My mother cried in her room, while Luca sat in the living room, watching television as if nothing had happened. That day, I realized that Luca was ready to go to extremes, to completely isolate us, and take everything away from us. Well, the truth, much worse than I could have imagined, began to unfold only when I enrolled in college. I needed my birth certificate to enroll, and my mother, Avenka, reluctantly gave it to me. I was sitting in my room, looking through documents, when an old piece of paper fell into my hands, hidden among the birth certificates. It was the deed to the family home, where we lived, the house that my mother had inherited from her mother, my grandmother, long before Luca came into our lives. At the bottom of the document, in small letters, there was a kind of agreement on a mortgage loan, signed several years earlier. And what shocked me to the core, my mother's signature, but also Luca's. And then the shock. The house was mortgaged to the bank, and for a considerable amount. Luca took over all the finances when he arrived, claiming that he was better with numbers. He said he would invest wisely in my mother's money, and that we were rich because of him. It turned out that wise investing was Luca's gambling and shady business deals. He mortgaged the house, our only remaining inheritance, without my mother's full knowledge or consent. He gave my mother only some papers to sign, telling her they were routine bank documents, or investments, for our future, and she signed them, trusting him blindly. I felt like the ground was being pulled out from under my feet. It was more than money. It was the betrayal of our home, our security, our history. The house was everything we had, our connection to past generations. Luca literally sold us for his own gain. He robbed me. I was overwhelmed with deep, burning grief over my mother's naivety and Luca's cruelty. At that moment, looking at that damn piece of paper, I realized that this was no longer just about me and my pain. This was about survival, about justice. Luca wanted to take everything away from us, to leave us with nothing. I couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. Something broke inside me. A quiet, determined decision formed in my mind. I had to act. I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear turned into cold determination. I didn't know how, but I knew I would fight. I would fight for myself, for my mother, for our home, for everything Luca had tried to destroy. I knew it would be a difficult path, full of challenges and dangers, but I was ready, because at that moment, I felt a strength I had never known before. It was a strength born out of darkness, out of pain, out of injustice, the strength to stand up for myself. Discovering the mortgage on our house was like a detonation. Images of Luca, that 8-year-old boy, began to overlap with Luca as he was now a manipulator, a deceiver, the one who had taken advantage of my mother's trust to rob us blind. Looking at that document, I realized that my story was much bigger than the malice in my room. It was a story of systematic theft, of complete control, of the destruction of everything we had. Fear was running through my veins. I withdrew into myself for a few days, pretending to be the usual Marija, but inside I was a warrior forging a plan. I couldn't believe my mother. How could she be so blind? How could she believe someone who was so obviously destroying our lives? But I knew that this was no time for hesitation. It was time for action. My first thought was proof. I had to find proof of Luca's betrayal. I began to move around the house like a ghost, quietly, unnoticed. Every one of Luca's boxes, every piece of paper, every bill became the target of my secret investigation. It was like detective work, except that the stakes were my life, my future, and my mother's future. I hid documents, photographed Luca's notes, and searched through old bills. I remember when I found a folder with gambling bills. The amounts were astronomical. Luca had been secretly wasting away all those years, using the house as an ATM. My stomach would knot every time I discovered something new, but at the same time, I felt stronger and more determined. Each new piece of evidence was a piece of the puzzle that was forming a complete picture of Luca's cruelty and my mother's suffering. One evening, when Luca was out and my mother had fallen asleep early, I found an old box with my mother's documents. Inside was her will. I had no right to read it, but something drew me to it, and there, in black and white, was a clause that shocked me. In the event of her death, everything, including the house, would go to Luca, to my mother. Her wishes. I had never felt such pain, such coldness. Luca had managed to manipulate my mother into naming him as her sole heir, completely disregarding me, her own child. It was a betrayal on a scale I could not have imagined. At that moment, I knew I had to take a step further. This was no longer just about money. It was about my existence. I couldn't let him erase me from my mother's life, even after her death. The next day, I turned to Nina. She had always been my rock, my confidant. I cautiously began to tell her about the situation, about Luca's behavior, about my mother's death, and then about the mortgage and the promissory note. Nina listened patiently, her face full of compassion and disbelief. When I finished, her face was pale. "Marija, this is terrible," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to do something. You need to see a lawyer." Her words confirmed what I already knew, but I hadn't dared to say out loud. I needed professional help. It wasn't easy to admit. I had been carrying this burden alone for years, but Nina gave me the strength to admit that I needed help. Together we began to investigate, discreetly, searching the internet for lawyers who specialize in inheritance and property law in Croatia. Luca was cunning, and his web of lies was complex. I knew I would need the best advice. That was the beginning of my plan. There was no turning back. Finding the right lawyer in Zagreb was a challenge, especially when you had to be extremely discreet. Nina was an incredible support. She helped me with the search, using her own laptop and phone to reduce the risk of Luca becoming suspicious. The days turned into non-stop research, cross-checking names, reading reviews. Finally, we found a name: Mr. Horvat, a lawyer known for his expertise in family and inheritance law. He had a small office in the city center, away from the main traffic routes, which promised discretion. I arranged a meeting under the pretext of asking about student loans, because I knew that Luca would closely follow everything I did related to finance. My heart was pounding as I entered Mr. Horvat's office. The walls were covered with books, and the smell of old leather and paper filled the air. It was a smell of seriousness, truth, and somehow hope. Mr. Horvat was a dignified man with glasses perched on his nose, and an expression that reflected both wisdom and kindness. I began to tell him my story, from the moment I was 8 years old, to the discovery of the mortgage, and his face, calm at first, became more serious with every sentence I uttered. When I finished, there was silence. "Marija," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, "what you have told me, if your statements are accurate, is very serious. It involves a series of criminal acts, including fraud and manipulation, as well as violations of family and inheritance law." He explained to me that, according to Croatian law, a mother has the right to dispose of her property, but if she was under pressure or misled, the will can be contested. Similarly, a mortgage loan, if taken out under false pretenses, or without full and informed consent, can be declared null and void. "His actions are, to say the least, questionable," said Mr. Horvat. "We need concrete evidence." I gave him everything I managed to gather: photographs of bank statements, Luca's gambling notes, copies of mortgage agreements that I found hidden, and even messages he sent to his mother that showed manipulation. Mr. Horvat carefully reviewed every document, shaking his head from time to time. "You're off to a good start," he said. "This is the foundation, but we'll need more. We'll have to investigate Luke's financial transactions, his business partners, and talk to your mother." I knew that talking to my mother would be the hardest part. I was afraid of her reaction, her accusations, her unwillingness to face the truth. "She's under his influence," I told Mr. Horvat. I'm afraid she'll defend him. Mr. Horvat looked at me with understanding. That's classic victim behavior. We'll need a strategy. We'll have to approach her carefully, with facts, and offer her protection. We agreed on the next steps. Mr. Horvat would begin preliminary investigations, seeking information about Luca's finances. I would return home and continue gathering evidence. If possible, the plan was clear: gather irrefutable evidence of Luca's fraud, then present it to my mother in a way that would open her eyes, and finally take legal action to protect the house and my future. I knew it would be a long road, but for the first time in my life, I felt I had an ally, someone who believed in my story and was willing to fight with me. I left Mr. Horvat's office with a feeling that was stronger than hope, a sense of purpose. It was intimidating, but at the same time liberating. I was no longer just Marija, a frightened child. I was Marija, a warrior, ready to face my enemy. Returning home after talking to Mr. Horvat was like returning to the battlefield. Every look from Luke, every gesture he made, now had a new meaning. I no longer saw him as an invincible tyrant, but as a problem that needed to be solved. My mission was clear: to find everything Luca was hiding, every trace of his deception. The days passed in a tense game of cat and mouse. First, I focused on the rooms where Luca spent most of his time: his office and the living room. I knew there had to be more evidence there. One evening, while Luca was out, and my mother was, as usual, engrossed in a TV program, I started searching through his desk. It was risky, but the feeling of urgency was stronger than the fear. Under a pile of papers and empty bills, I found a hidden drawer. Inside was Luca's old laptop and a USB stick. My heart was pounding as I turned on the laptop. It was locked with a password, of course, but Luca's password was predictable: his date of birth. I succeeded. Inside was treasure: emails with his colleagues, reminders of gambling debts, and even scanned documents showing fake companies through which he had laundered money. There was also a transcript from the bank, where Luca had obviously forged his mother's signature for another small loan, without her knowledge. I wrote everything down, copied the data onto a USB stick, feeling cold determination. The evidence was piling up, and with it my determination. The plan was now taking shape. The next step was to confront Luca, but not directly, not right away. First, I had to break down his strongest wall: his mother's naivety and indulgence. I knew that would be the hardest part. His mother, Ivanka, was Luca's strongest defender, because she supported him blindly. I had to wait for the right moment, when Luca wouldn't be at home, and when I would have her undivided attention. I had to present the facts to her in such a way that she couldn't ignore them. That day, Luca left on a business trip. It was my chance. Later that afternoon, while we were sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV, I approached my mother. "Mom, we need to talk," I said, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. Her face, tired and pale, turned toward me, with a hint of caution in her eyes. I began in a gentle tone, remembering Mr. Horvat's words: "You are a victim, Marija. You need empathy, not blame." I told her about the mortgage, about Luca's gambling, about the debts he had accumulated in our name. I mentioned the documents I had found. I took out a copy of the will and placed it in front of her. "Mom, Luca left the house to himself in the event of your death. I am not mentioned." Her face froze. She looked at the document, then at me, and then her eyes filled with tears. "No, Marija, that's not true. He convinced me that I was doing it for us. He said it was for security. You just don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I raised you to trust people." It was an old refrain, but this time, in her eyes, I saw suspicion, a trembling spark of realization. Then I showed her the emails, the credit card bills, Luke's fake business contracts. Each document was a blow to her illusion. I saw her world crumbling before her eyes. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She began to stammer uncontrollably. "No, no, it can't be," she whispered, covering her face with her hands. I believed him. I cried, for the first time in many years, feeling her trembling body in my arm. There was no more anger, only sadness and empathy. It was too late to save her from Luke's web, but it wasn't too late to save her from a long decline. "Mom, I know it hurts," I said, gently caressing her hair. "But we have to fight. We have to take back what is ours. We have to go to a lawyer." We sat there for a while, crying and talking. I told her about Mr. Horvat, about what he had told me. Slowly, cautiously, she began to ask questions. Each question was a step toward accepting the truth. That evening, something changed between us. The walls began to come down. I felt it for the first time in many years. Luca's return home, 2 days later, was like entering a minefield. The tension was palpable. He was greeted by silence, unusual for their otherwise harmonious home. I felt his gaze on me, full of suspicion. He knew Luca was too cunning not to notice the change. He knew something had happened. His face had changed, becoming cold and hostile. "What's going on here?" His voice was like ice. Luca's return home was filled with an invisible tension. He entered our apartment in Zagreb, wearing a false facade of self-confidence, but I saw the glimmer of suspicion in his eyes. He noticed the silence, unusual for our home. My mother Ivanka was different. There were none of her usual chores, none of her incessant activity that concealed her pain. She sat in the armchair, pale, staring at the floor, and I stood next to her, tall and calm, feeling the walls of my inner fortress closing in. "What's going on here?" Luca's voice was cold, but with a hint of nervousness. His eyes narrowed, searching my face for an answer, trying to figure out where the crack in his perfect control had appeared. I decided to wait for him calmly, without emotion. "We talked, Luca," I said, my voice steady, without a trace of the fear that had haunted me for years. "About everything." His gaze shifted from me to my mother. "What's this about Ivanka?" he said, trying to sound gentle, but there was steel in his words. Ivanka looked up, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him, and there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, but sadness, mixed with the bitterness of realization. "About our house, Luca," she said, her voice barely audible, but loud enough to be heard in the tense silence. "About the mortgage, about the bail." At that moment, Luca's mask cracked, his face contorted. The feigned kindness disappeared, revealing raw, unadulterated anger. "What did you fill her head with, Maria?" he roared, stepping toward me. "You're lying. You're making it up. Because of your lies, I raised you better than that." Those words were like arrows fired at me, but they couldn't hurt me anymore. It was his old tactic, his usual game, attack and blame. But I was ready. "I'm not making anything up, Luca," I said, pulling a folder of documents out of my bag. They were copies I had made for my mother, but now they served as weapons. "These are Luca's documents, mortgage agreements, bank statements, with gambling debts, emails with partners, a will naming you as the sole heir. It's all here." I threw them on the table in front of him. The documents scattered. Luca rushed toward the papers, then toward us. His face was red with rage, his eyes bulging. He began gathering the papers, crumpling them in his fists. "This is a trap. It's all a lie. You're crazy, Maria." "I'm not crazy, Luca," I replied, my voice firm. "And your lie is over. I've already spoken to a lawyer. Mr. Horvat is familiar with the situation. He is a lawyer specializing in inheritance and family law in Zagreb. He warned me that your actions are contrary to Croatian law. These are criminal offenses." The mention of the lawyer was the last straw in his control. Luca's face turned pale. His fear was replaced by panic. He knew he was trapped. I saw his eyes darting around, looking for a way out, but there was none. "Lawyer," he stammered, his voice broken. "What have you done?" "I did what had to be done," I said. "I protected myself and my mother." Ivanka, who had been silent until now stood up. She looked at Luca with bitterness. "How could you, Luca?" Her voice trembled. "How could you betray us like that?" Her words, simple and full of pain, were heavier than any accusation. Luca looked at her, and I saw a rare moment of something that looked like shame, before he went back on the defensive. He tried again, but now his words sounded empty. His manipulations, his threats, no longer had any power. I knew that this first confrontation had been successful. The ice had been broken. Now we just had to follow the plan. After that first clash, the air in our apartment in Zagreb was thick with unspoken accusations and broken trust. Luca was furious, but also scared. His facade of power was crumbling, and underneath it lay a cuckoo caught in its own web of lies. He tried to avoid me, but he continued to manipulate my mother, Ivanka, trying to convince her that I was crazy and that we wanted to ruin him. But my mother was no longer blind. Although she was still struggling with her own feelings of shame and pain because of Luca's betrayal, the spark of truth that I had ignited in her was burning brightly. Luca's words no longer had the same weight. It was all too much. Mr. Horvat invited us to a second meeting. This time, my mother came with me. She sat next to me, her hands clasped in her lap, her face full of fear, but also quiet determination. Mr. Horvat was patient, carefully explaining to my mother her rights, Luke's deception, and the options available to us. He showed her additional evidence that his team had managed to uncover copies of statements from Luca's secret accounts, records of his meetings with suspicious business partners, and even receipts from illegal gambling dens. Miss Ivanka, Mr. Horvat said, Luca has broken numerous laws. This is not just a family dispute. This is a criminal offense. We have a strong case. The mother listened, her face gradually changing. I saw how sadness turned to anger, then to determination. Her words, I raised you to be responsible, now sounded like she was talking to herself, not to me. I want you to deal with him, she said, her voice trembling but firm. I want my life back. I want my house back. It was unbelievable. The woman who had been silent for years was now ready to fight. It was a turning point. Mr. Horvat immediately initiated legal proceedings. He filed a lawsuit for breach of trust and mortgage fraud, citing Luca's deception and his mother's inability to make informed decisions due to manipulation. He also filed a report for financial fraud. Luca was in shock. When the first official papers arrived, he tried to fight back. He threatened, called, yelled at his mother on the phone, calling me a broken daughter. You don't treat your mother like that, he yelled at her, trying to scare her again. But his mother didn't back down. Enough, Luca, she said to him once on the phone, and I could hear her voice trembling, but he didn't give in. It's all over. Over the course of several weeks, we prepared for the trial. It was exhausting. I had to relive the painful moments, talk about what Luca did to me when I was a child. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered Luca's smile, that knock on the door, and the realization that my mother had betrayed me. And then I would remember how I exposed him, how I found the evidence, how I convinced my mother to fight. That strength kept me going. The final confrontation took place in court. Luca came alone, without a lawyer, probably confident that he would win with his manipulative story. But this time, he wasn't dealing with naive Ivan or frightened Marija. He was dealing with the truth. Miss Horvat presented the case with extraordinary precision. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, every document we had collected was like a blow that shattered Luca's defense. My mother testified, her voice quiet but clear, describing how Luca had manipulated her, how he had pressured her to sign documents without reading them. Her tears were not tears of weakness, but tears of liberation. When it was my turn, I took a deep breath. I looked Luca in the eyes, the man who had stolen my childhood and tried to steal my future. His gaze was full of hatred, but I also saw panic in it. I told my story, from the very beginning, about the locked doors, the fear, the isolation. I spoke about the years of suffering, about discovering the deception, about how I had to fight for my life. There were no tears in my eyes, only the pure, cold truth. When I finished, there was silence in the courtroom. Luca was visibly shaken. His pride, his reputation, his power, it was all crumbling before his eyes. Poetic justice. After my testimony, Luca's defense was weak and ineffective. He tried to deny everything, accused me of lying, and his mother of mental instability, but the evidence presented by Miss Horvat was irrefutable. The judge listened attentively, and Luca's words sounded empty and desperate. Luca, in a fit of rage, tried to play his last card. She made it all up, he shouted, pointing at me. It's a cover-up because I never accepted her as my daughter's. His last sentence was pure manipulation, an attempt to portray me as a criminal, a gold-digging girl. But at that moment, it sounded pathetic. I looked at him with little emotion, with a sense of victory that was quiet but deep. The judge handed down his verdict quickly and without hesitation. The mortgage loan was declared null and void, the will was revoked, returning our house to my mother's sole ownership, with a clear stipulation that I would inherit it after her death. Luca was found guilty of financial fraud and manipulation, with an order to pay damages and possible criminal charges to follow. This was not just a legal triumph, it was a complete victory for justice. Luca left the court with his head bowed, destroyed, defeated. His reputation in Zagreb, his status as a successful businessman, was ruined. The people he worked with and trusted learned the truth about his fraud. I saw him leaving, and the feeling of satisfaction was not gloating, but liberate. It was poetic justice. The loss of what he valued most, his power and reputation, was worse than any punishment. My mother Ivanka and I left the courtroom holding hands. At first her face was pale from exhaustion, but then a look of relief appeared on it, and even a quiet, small smile. Years of suffering and fear melted away. It wasn't easy. The healing process had only just begun. Our relationship was fragile, weighed down by years of unspoken truths, but for the first time, I felt that we were moving towards something better. The days and weeks that followed were devoted to clearing Luca's legacy from our lives. Under the guidance of Mr. Horvat, my mother took control of her finances. She changed the locks on the house, and Luca's things were packed up and sent to the address we got from the lawyer. He never showed up or even tried to return them. Life began to return to normal, but it was no longer the same normal. It was a new beginning. My mother and I began to talk, really talk, about everything. It was painful. There were tears, but every word spoken was a step toward healing. She told me about her fears, about how Luca had gradually taken control of her life, how he had convinced her that she was helpless without him. Her "I raised you" had now become, "I'm sorry, Maria, I should have protected you," and I forgave. Not immediately, but with time, I realized that she too was a victim, trapped in Luca's web of manipulation. My pain over her passivity was still there, but it was replaced by empathy. Relationships don't get fixed overnight, but we built a new foundation. Brick by brick, I help my mom with money. We study together. We laugh. We even cook sarmu. Remembering better days, home has become our home again. A safe haven. I will never forget the locked doors and the sound of the doorbell. But now, when I wake up, I no longer feel fear. I feel peace. And I know that I survived. I know that I fought, and I know that I won. I feel empowered. My story is not just a story of surviving abuse. It is a story of taking control, of seeking justice, of finding strength within myself when it seems that all is lost. It is a story of how a quiet, invisible struggle can grow into a decisive, visible victory. And as I sit here, in my home in Zagreb, looking through the window at the streets that were once the backdrop to my fear, I know that I am free. I am free to live my life by my own rules, and no one will ever take that away from me again. My heart is calm, and my strength is unquestionable.